I've been asked a bunch of times about what operators are good in IS4, basically once a stream, so I thought I'd make a proper list on it. Obviously I'm going to analyze it from the perspective of 4 stars only, but I think the same logic applies when you're using higher rarity as well. So, we'll go by class to make it a bit faster. First of all, Myrtle is basically a must-have. The whole gimmick of IS4 is that most of the stages put you under enormous DP pressure. If you can actually deploy your operators, you're fine, but it's very difficult to set up. As such, a high source of DP is extremely important. Even beyond being the best Vanguard for DP, Myrtle can also function as a medic to keep some other operator alive. Her own attack is kind of high for a Vanguard, so she can usually kill a chest before stage ends. Basically, if you get a Vanguard ticket, this is the only reasonable pick when it comes to 4 stars. For the other 3, Courier and Scavenger are absolutely not worth it. Basically, the only circumstance I can see somebody picking them is if you already have Myrtle but have the DP debuff and just desperately need more DP. They just melt to basic enemies, so they're functionally no different to Fang or Vanilla, especially early on. Vigna I'd want to put here cause I really like using Vigna, but her own damage is hard to use. Usually by the time her skill ults she just dies to basic enemies. And even the basic enemies in IS are basically just boxers, so they hit really hard and fast. Having stuff that dies easily just isn't useful. You can use her for a DPS, but it has to be on a side tile, and she's competing with other people for that role. When squad spots are limited, she kinda falls off. On top of that, she doesn't scale that well with items. No spinach, a bit nerfed on attack speed because of the her own S2 slowing her attack. Beanstalk, on the other hand, does have some use. She does provide some DPS, but I'd only pick her after Myrtle, because the crab can be used to tank a various number of bullshit. You can use it to tank arts damage, the ending 3 boss can absorb a hit from that. Since the crab can't actually die, it has its uses. It's even usable to stall the ending 4 bosses a bit, though I haven't been able to make use of that myself for now. If I get a second Vanguard ticket, I would always pick Beanstalk over any of the other ones. Though ideally, in most of my runs I'd want to only rely on Myrtle. For the medics, Chestnut's only gimmick is that he heals elemental damage. His skills are bad, his healing is bad, there is no elemental damage in IS4, there's zero reason to pick him here. Mer isn't terrible, but her own power pales in comparison to her other medics, who are all decent at their job. In my experience, you could take any of them and they all do well enough. Personally, I prefer Pure Stream and Perfumer for their wider range on Pure Stream, and for the global healing countering that relic that debuffs your health again. But you can take the other ones, I've had successful runs with them. They're all fairly interchangeable. If you want a better medic that's just for healing, over the 3-star ones, these are the better options. For guards, Frostleaf has one particular use. If you're doing the ending 2 boss, she can actually slow him down so he runs a smaller distance. I wouldn't ever consider picking her just for that, cause she's useless everywhere else, but yeah, she does that. And we have 2 other candidates for the Frostleaf tier. Basically, Bee Hunter and Jackie are just for dodge coping. If you're dodge coping in IS4, you should probably rethink what you're doing. Jackie does scale well with items, but other operators do it better, so she's not worth picking just for that. Conviction, Doberman, and Estelle all go in the pick a 3-star tier. Basically, they will just die to basic enemies and they don't even do that much damage. Conviction can be funny with items though, so I'll put her ahead of the crowd here. Estelle is by far the worst, scales poorly with items, dies to basic enemies. Doberman and Conviction at least have spinach procs, but that's not enough. Generally, all 4-star guards are bad. They die too easily and they don't do enough. I'd say the only one I rank highly is Cutter. She's still kind of not great and I'd rather have other things, but that's more of a function of the maps. She has the damage even without items, but it's hard to find tiles on which she can be good, because the maps are so tight early on. She is fine later though, on higher stages. Ideally I'd only get a few guard tickets. If I get a bunch of them, that usually spells a bad run for me. Now, the rest are mostly in the niche category. Mostly can be used to debuff the ending one boss, that keeps you alive. Apart from that, her own DPS is decent, she's close to a normal caster. Wu Xiaohe and the Rin are okay, because they have range, so they don't have to play like melee operators. Even though they melt to 2 hits, you can put them in positions where they won't get hit, but they can still DPS. Okay, but I'd rather get a caster, and neither of them scales well with items. Matuimaru can be used to tank art damage with her S1, like ending 3 boss. She has the health not to be one-shot, so she's a decent body for that. Hummus is almost in the Pika 3-star tier, he just dies to basic enemies. He scales really well with items, because his attack increase, the attack speed increases his healing, he scales with healing gain, defensive items, spinach, basically anything you get is good on Hummus. So he has the potential to go crazy, but his base power is awful. I would avoid picking him. Utage is shockingly to me, just really bad in IS4. She dies to 2 hits, so she can't properly use her attack speed. With injury trigger she can at least get her full attack speed, but you need some tile where she can safely DPS the enemy. And even then she basically only kills one enemy and then you have to retreat her. While IS4 spams a bunch of enemies at you. Not great, I wouldn't take her. Quartz can get 1v1'd by a basic enemy. She's basically unusable because of that, but she can be used to fight the casters, since they have no advantage against her. You can use other operators for that just as well, so I wouldn't specifically spend hope just for that. It's a very generic role that many other operators can fill. Like Matuimaru, she has enough health not to be one-shot by the ending 3 boss, but she'll die to other random stuff because there's a lot of physical damage on that map as well. There are better options for doing that. On to the defenders. The only ones I rank highly, Quora and Bubble, because they can actually tank stuff. They give you an option against physical damage, which is plenty in the event. Oh, the other ones will just die to basic enemies throughout the run. Of the other ones, the best one is Gummy. Her healing can scale with spinach, healing items, etc. And she can heal quite a bit, but if you're relying on your Gummy for healing, your run is probably screwed anyway. Durner and, sadly for me, Utunada basically go into the Pika 3-star tier. Durner will just die to basic enemies, she's like a guard, her defense isn't high enough to be worth picking. Utunada will struggle a bit more to die, because she actually has a defense increase skill, but she won't kill anything, she doesn't scale with items, there's no reason to pick her. Matterhorn, shockingly enough, has an issues. He's really good for tanking the ending 3 boss, and he has enough health that he won't instantly melt if a physical enemy touches him, unlike somebody. So he's decent for that. I basically never pick him though, because my other tickets will go to other stuff first before I get to Matterhorn. If I get enough defender tickets and I'm going for ending 3, it makes sense to pick him, but realistically it never comes up. Because a squad with that many defenders will probably die on the way. On to the snipers. So snipers are a bit complicated. Totter is by far the best one to actually have in my squad. He does a ton of damage, has range, is relatively cheap on DP, scales well with items, can cheese the ending for encounter because it's full of invisible enemies. Great operator, has an issues, but is strong even outside of it. Basically the sniper I want every time, but despite that I can never start with him, because he's a bad starter. At E1 he's gonna struggle with the mass of enemies, and most of the floor 1 and floor 2 stages are just a mass of enemies. Which is where Pinecone comes in. She cheeses the early stages really hard, and lets me consistently get to floor 1 and 2. She also has uses later, she scales well with items. She's basically mandatory to play the Coapso drone stage on floor 4 with 4 stars. So I never have a reason to skip her. She remains useful later, despite her extremely high DP cost. Next we have Caper and May, who are kind of weird to describe. So basically, May has much better crowd control and can support your other operators by keeping an enemy in place. Caper has way higher damage than May, but May has better item scaling. Caper can't use attack speed well, she can't use spinach well, so May will surpass her if you have those items. Otherwise Caper will do way more damage, and in the absence of spinach or high attack speed, what you want depends on whether you want CC or more damage. Vermeil is... there's just no reason to pick Vermeil. She's a sniper, every sniper shoots stuff, she doesn't do anything else. Meteor reduces defense by 35%. You can count that as 100 damage, 35 damage for every 100 defense the enemy has. And Jessica can be used for dodge coping. Unlike the other dodge copers, she has 75% dodge, which is high enough to actually be reliable. If you want to move her to that tier though, that's fine with me. Beyond that, her S1 scales well with items, she has very close damage to main in that circumstance, so if you get spinach and shit, she actually does damage. But without items, she does 0 damage. Acid drop, you can even move her a tier down in Shiryuki. On theory, they should be good with items, but I've never had a situation where they're actually reliable. And I've managed to get good value out of them. Mostly because I have a ton of better snipers to pick from. But even when I've tried them early, they didn't do well for me. Not a fan. I wouldn't pick them for anything in particular. You can use Acid Drop to cheese enemies with high defense, I guess, but you can do that with Haze as well. Ambriel is a bit higher than the other snipers, I'd say. Basically, she can hyperscale with items, the sniper relic, some attack speed, some attack, and she goes through the roof and two-shots everything. The sniper hand for Ambriel and Totter is extremely strong as well, so if you have that, she's especially worth picking. If you don't have items though, she's horrible. She's not worth the DP, her DPS is ass, she doesn't do anything. So she's potentially extremely powerful, but extremely dependent on items. Next, on to the casters. Basically, we have two good casters in Click and Indigo. They have crowd control, they do damage, and more damage than all my other casters. I start with Click because she has much higher DPS and it gives me more consistent early floors, but Indigo is actually the caster I prefer, because her crowd control is so much better at keeping enemies in place. For the other casters, I'd say Grey, Pudding and Haze go into the niche use. Pudding is not horrible, but the reason she's probably even further back is because we already have Pinecone. For AoE options, Pinecone already does the job. Pinecone can deal with even high defense, so there's just no role for Pudding to fill. Grey is here because he's a very strong crowd control option with his S2. You can use him to keep stuff in place. I really wouldn't recommend picking him, even for 4 stars only. There are other casters you want first, but if you have a million caster tickets, he has some function. Haze can be used to deal with enemies with high res, like the ending 4 bosses. She's basically here just for that. Outside of that, her damage is bad, pick the other casters. And Gitano is bad, pick every other caster before her. Her own SP cycle is horrible, she doesn't do anything special compared to the other casters, no reason to pick her. Supporters, we basically have two good supporters and they're both in the niche use category. Podenko, she gives you early healing, the silence can be useful, it's some extra arts damage. Decent all around. Roberta has two functions. Early on, if say you're stuck with just Spot on floor 3 and he dies to basic enemies, one Roberta device and then they can no longer do anything to him, because he gains up to 800 defense and he can tank the basic enemies just fine. Later on you use the shields to avoid one-shots. Basically a support unit for other ones. I'd rather not get a supporter ticket if all I have to pick is Roberta. Mostly I just pick her when I need more block, because the other option for block and supporters, Deep Cover, is unusable. Basically, even if you get her buff items, her tentacles just melt to everything and do no damage. There's no reason to use her, she's not worth the DP. Earth Spirit, I can see somebody make an argument that you can get something out of her S2, but we have much better tools to slow. Podenko, Grey, Ethan, May, Indigo. I don't see a niche for her. I have like 5 other slow operators I can bring before her. And finally we have the Specialist. Obviously Ethan is broken. This circles back to the whole DP issue we started with in Myrtle. You need DP because the maps are really tight, and Ethan provides a ton of DP. Because he can tank stuff from casters, he can deal with trash mobs, he slows enemies down by binding them, so you have more time to deploy other shit. He kills trash, so you don't need to deploy the DPS for trash right away and can prioritize a caster for tankier enemies, etc, etc. He just does many things while he's consistent and relatively cheap. He really needs his E2, and because of that all of the other specialists are kind of bad, because you would always prioritize Ethan over any of them in any circumstance. Now the other big specialist is Jae, which might be surprising, but I actually find him to be kind of bad. To put it simply, he relies too much on items, and the way merchants work, where they eat your DP, is very unfavorable in IS4. IS4 is really tight on DP, you can get up to a 40% DP debuff permanently, so it's very difficult to rely on Jaya for anything. On top of that, he can just die to casters before he manages to charge up. If you don't have any items or other operators to help him, he'll outright die before his Q activates, and then he doesn't do anything. He can be great with items, but you don't always get the items. Realistically, I'd rely on the big Verdant head and Gravel over him. If I don't have some good items that specifically benefit Jaya, like starting SP, damage, some extra health, I'd probably pick these two because at least they absorb attacks and protect my other operators better, while costing less DP overall. The specialists are kind of fine, but I'd probably not ever bother picking them, simply because there's other specialists you want, and by the point you get later into the game, there's not as many hosts. They're decent early because there's a lot of hosts, but if I get a specialist ticket early, I just won't eat them. So I wouldn't ever really pick them, even though they're kind of okay because there's hosts for them to abuse. Once you have a need to Ethan, on all the maps with hosts, he takes care of the enemies anyway. So these are kind of redundant with Ethan, and you favor Ethan because Ethan is also better on stages that don't have hosts. I guess I drank Shao a bit higher, because you can do some style setups with her skill too, and a bunch of slowers. But that's a really niche use, I've never run into it yet myself. Okay, that's about everything from me. Have a nice day.